view of what he does. I've asked him to come back and be more specific on maybe some areas we could really look at and focus on for this committee, and he has graciously accepted. So welcome back, Steve Anderson, Medicaid Inspector General, to committee.
Thank you, Senator or Chairwoman Erickson. I am Steve Anderson. I appreciate the opportunity to come back and address this committee again. And it's always a pleasure to come, so don't be afraid to ask. There should be a presentation available to everybody that I put together. It's kind of an outline of some things, but just want to remind everybody, the core mission of our office is to look at fraud, waste, and abuse in the Medicaid program. That's what we try to do. We do this through audits and reviews and investigations. As a reminder, the state Medicaid program is a $5.5 billion program per year, and the costs continue to go up. Last year, the program served on average 467,440 beneficiaries in a year. There's many areas that we could look at if we had the resources, and we'd love to identify more savings. On the presentation, there is a list of every audit that has been performed by my audit by our office since 2021. And again, we are a relatively new office, and this is some points I'll make throughout the presentation. Is prior to me becoming the Inspector General, the office consisted of 2 people, and we really didn't have much of a presence. At one point, the Inspector General's office was part of what is now KDHE, and they shut down in 2014 because they were just literally starved to death. No resources. The Inspector General's position went vacant for a long time. And then finally, it was moved over to the IG's office, was moved over to the AG's office in 2017 via Senate Bill 149, and slowly started building it up. So we are what I consider to be a fairly baby office, and I think it's what's caused some of the issues that I'd like to talk about in here, is when we've had reportable findings and issues that are put out there, they will sometimes track the issues in within the Bob Bethel Committee. And for those of you not familiar with it, that's the Committee on Care as well as Home and Community-Based Services. It's a great opportunity. I testify 4 times a year for that committee. But they have tracking sheets that they use for putting those issues on there. And in fact, in the handout packet, I put 2 on the back of this presentation that address certain things, and I'll get to those as we go along. But as far as the things that we identify, and you'll see on these audits, it basically racks up. We've had a total of 34 findings of the audits we've performed, and then 83 recommendations. Sometimes the agencies agree with our recommendations. Sometimes they agree with the findings. Other times they absolutely disagree, but there's no way to fix that. There's no recourse. If the agency says we don't agree with that finding, that's one thing. And I've even had them say, well, we acknowledge the finding. And that's it. We neither agree or disagree. It's just we acknowledge it, thank you, and that's it. Because when we do an audit, part of the process is we always send the audit report to them, and they get an opportunity to respond to it, and that response is always included in our final product that goes out. So if you go to any of these audits, and I provided a link there, you will find the response from KDHE, KDADS, whoever is the auditee is given an opportunity, and that it becomes part of the published report is their responses to our findings and recommendations. Something else that would happen, and this happens with some, with the federal government when they do audits, is they put a corrective action plan out there on auditees if there's significant findings or issues that need to be resolved. And that corrective action plan is placed, and then they're told to how it should be fixed. It happens a lot in the nursing home industry too, is if the nursing home surveyors come in and they find some issues, they put a tag on somebody, they will then put them on a corrective action plan. And we don't do that. That process has not been developed with us, and I think it's something we would like to go forward with, and I think that's something that would be a good recommendation from the committee, is that we have corrective action plans placed on any findings that come out of our audit reports. Would be very helpful as far as tracking purposes. And because right now there's no tracking, there's no answer back on, hey, you had this finding, here's what we figured out, and here's what we did to correct it, and letting us know that it was corrected. We do intend to do a follow-up audit when as resources allow some of our places we've looked at, and one of the big ones you'll hear about is the home and community-based services audit that we did, where we had numerous findings, a lot of recommendations. We intend to do a follow-up audit and go back and look at some of the areas that we touched on there, and that was a few years ago. And at the time, I had one auditor and one analyst. We're a little better staffed today. We're still pretty thin, but we're going to go in and take a look at it because that was a big issue. We found, over $100 million worth of just wasteful spending. We identified savings that could have been had, and the responses we typically got were, we're not going to do anything about it. And we want to correct that, and one way to do that is do follow-up audits. And if we had put them on a corrective action plan, that would have given us something more to go back and look at. And like I said, there's no recourse for us if there is a disagreement. It just falls right there. We do brief on our audits at the Bethel Committee, so they're made aware of it, and that's how things get on there. I would also say, just before we dive into some of the examples, there's contracts. Obviously, the big ones that were recently done was the CanCare contract, where we recently reassigned MCOs. We had zero input on anything to do with those contracts. I tried. I talked to the secretary for KDHE, and I talked to the Medicaid director at the time, Sarah Fertig, and said, hey, I have a significant contracting background, because I do. I would love to provide some input. I'd like to see what you're doing, what you're putting together. What does this contract look like? And basically, I said, well, just send us any ideas you might have. And was completely rebuffed on having any part in it. I think that our office should be part of any Medicaid-related contract that is put out there and give us an opportunity to review it, look it over, make sure it's sufficient, and provide input. It wouldn't necessarily bind their hands, but at least allow us to see what provisos are in the contract about having, if we can go and seek like recoupments, or does the contract have any teeth to it? I do understand that the current contract has more teeth than the previous contract, but I think there's also still some areas that are a little gray. We reviewed the contract recently, and the state can recoup money. There are places where they can put punishments on the MCOs, but I believe there's opportunities for more that could be done to hold the MCOs accountable as far as what their responsibilities are. It could be more spelled out. And one of the areas that was an issue at the last Bethel is the amount of, the MCOs are required to have a provider network that has to be sufficient. And I didn't see a lot of areas in there where if they don't have, what are the punishments to the contractor? The MCOs, how are they going to be held accountable for having a lack of provider network, and what has to be done about that? The MCOs are also required to have a program integrity unit, and the provisos for that, as far as that program integrity piece, are very limited as well. They do specify they have to live in the state now. Before, they didn't do that. But those program integrity units are really important for help identify fraud, because we get some referrals from those. So that's an area. And again, one of the places I was really disappointed is I'd like to have seen the MCOs required to send out explanations of benefits to Medicaid beneficiaries. I touched on a little bit the other day. Blue Cross Blue Shield, whatever insurance company you may have in the private sector, they send you an explanation of benefits anytime you see the doctor, or even the dentist or anything like that. And if you have very many health problems, you sometimes may seem like you get an EOB every day. But we look at them very carefully. My wife's a former nurse. She looks over our EOBs like a hawk, looking for any issues. And a former colleague of mine who was with Blue Cross Blue Shield said that's where they got most of the referrals on any kind of problems with providers, is through those EOBs, because people would see it and see where they were charged for an x-ray or a scan or a test that didn't happen. They'd report it to Blue Cross, and then they would go and find out the provider was in fact cheating or upcoding or doing other billing type frauds that were existing. But in the Medicaid world, we do not require the MCOs to send out EOBs to Medicaid beneficiaries. So if I'm a provider who's corrupt and I have your Medicaid ID, I can be billing Medicaid for services to you, and you would never know, because you would never hear about it. It would want to come up later if you happen to go to another doctor and he said, well, I see you've been getting all these x-rays. What's that all about? And you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Because the Medicaid beneficiaries rightfully don't pay anything. There's no out-of-pocket cost for them. So it makes it almost the perfect crime for a provider to be doing that. And we're looking at a matter right now where there's counseling companies that have been billing for way more hours in a day than humanly possible, and they're smartly splitting it up across the MCOs so that it doesn't show up. So you have a provider who's billing for a lot of hours, but they break it down so they don't hit the same MCO. They hit all three of the MCOs across the board and spread it out. And we're finding out, and it's millions of dollars in billings. That'll be a case that you'll hear more about down the road. But that's an example where if the beneficiaries were getting OBs, they would have seen that all those hours were being billed to them and perhaps would have reported the fraud, but they couldn't. So, and on the issue of reporting fraud, one of the first audit reports or things that we did was the first one called Hotline Access. And it was a pet issue for me when I became the Inspector General. I had worked at the Medicaid Fraud and Abuse Division prior to that, and we would frequently get people that would call, and that office cannot do eligibility fraud. They're forbidden by their federal grant from doing anything to do with eligibility fraud. And we were constantly getting referrals on eligibility fraud, and it's like, what's going on? We would talk to the clearinghouses, why are you sending people here for eligibility issues? Well, this is the number we have. So I did a little research. We actually did some ruse calls, did some checking on it. Well, the CanCare clearinghouses, which were everybody's told, hey, if you have a Medicaid issue, call the clearinghouse. They have a call tree. You know, push 1 for this, push 2 for that. One thing they didn't have is a place to report fraud at all. And if you stuck on the line long enough and just hit one of the numbers, well, I'll wait and talk to somebody. If you waited and you would talk to somebody eventually after maybe a 15, 20-minute wait, and then ask them, well, how do I report eligibility fraud or any kind of fraud? Half the time they would give people the wrong number because they didn't know either. We did get them finally, after this, to come up with a number that now whenever you call there, that's one of your choices on the call tree is to report fraud. And it actually routes you to the DCF fraud area, which is the right number to call. But that took a lot of effort to get that. So you can imagine how frustrating it would be for the average citizen wanting to report fraud to get rebuffed or be given an incorrect number because there was no way to get a hold of it. And our number of fraud referrals went up substantially after that was resolved. And I also had an opportunity again to talk to Sarah Furtick, who was the Medicaid director at the time, because we also pointed out that their website was almost impossible to navigate. And I asked her, so would you please show me on your website when if I go on the CanCare website where I can report fraud? She couldn't find it either. That was the Medicaid director. They have since corrected that since the websites have been updated, but it took years to get that done. And you know, oftentimes the complaints we deal, we dealt with over almost 1,500 complaints last year. A lot of them involved eligibility, and a lot of them come through that DCF hotline to us. We get direct calls as well. But imagine how frustrating it is for people from a standpoint of government efficiency. You want people to report fraud, right? And as an agency, we need to make it as easy as possible to report fraud, not difficult. And that was one of the really big problems, was just that ability to report it out and get it in the hands of people who can do something with it. So that was one of the things we corrected. Let me take you on to page 2 of 6. Where we talk about, and we have an example, and this is from our eligibility audit that was done, and we found that the capitation payments should have been recouped, but were not. We identified some places. We looked at the contract at the time and said that the contractor, we could recoup, in fact, from them. And if you go to page 3, there's a highlighted area where right above that, we see, you know, their response. This is KDHE's response to us, where they say KDHE is not contractually or statutorily obligated to recoup capitation payments for CanCare members who are later discovered to be residing out of the state. That was one of those real clear-cut issues. If you move out of state, your eligibility ends then. Even during COVID, if you moved out of state, your eligibility ended. There was no question about it. So they said the agency may recoup those payments depending on the facts of the case, and in the cases identified in the report, the MCOs remained at risk for medical expenses incurred by the members at all times that were Medicaid eligible, and therefore the agency did not believe recoupments were in order. That's one of those areas where we had a disagreement about them retaining eligibility. The fact that KDHE did not exercise its discretion to recoup capitation payments from the MCOs for the cases identified in the report does not mean improper activity occurred. That's a quote from them. I rebutted and said we recognize that you have the discretion to recoup or not, but we disagreed with them about that situation. And we said, you know, for a good example is where persons are not using CanCare but are receiving Medicaid benefits in other states where they currently reside. That's easy enough to do. You heard yesterday it was talked about the Paris reports. Paris is a program that's put together. It's run by the federal government. Every state Medicaid office, as well as cash assistance like food stamps and SNAP, dump information into the Paris thing, and what they look for is matching. So if you find beneficiaries who are receiving benefits in multiple states, we've had situations where sometimes people are getting benefits in 4 or 5 states at the same time, not just 2. But it tells us that this person has left Kansas and is now receiving benefits in Tennessee, for example. So it's pretty clear cut that they've done that. KDHE chose to ignore that and said, well, they might still be eligible because they're signed up. So we looked at it and we found in the last paragraph that's bolded there, we conducted a further review of those cases and we found people living out of state and we're able to identify them as having coverage in the new state of residence. So there's no question. Some people just don't call the state and say, hey, I don't have eligibility anymore. They don't cancel it. Other people do it maliciously, but some people just they're not doing anything wrong, they just didn't call, or they did call and it never got punched into the computer right. So it's not the beneficiary necessarily doing anything wrong, sometimes it is. And I have talked about this before. Kansas Medicaid's wonderful. People move to Missouri and Oklahoma, they prefer to hang on to their CanCare if they can, because we have better benefits than those states do apparently because they choose to hang on to CanCare. But at any rate, we looked at it and we found that the state could easily save $100,000 per quarter, could be recouped from the MCOs, which would be $400,000 a year, just by simply saying, hey, this person's clearly living in another state, they're no longer eligible for Kansas Medicaid, you MCO were not at risk financially, so you could recoup $400,000 a year easily. And those are very conservative numbers. I'm sure it would be more if they would actually sharpen their pencil. But as far as I know, they've never done it. This is one of those things where we'd really love to have a corrective action plan, have some follow-up with them on these type of things where they didn't do. And let me take you to example 2, which is on page 4 of 6. This concerns the Life Alert bracelets. This is part of the home and community-based service audit we looked at. We found that there were 560 beneficiaries who were getting the Life Alert bracelet without any other medical claims. One of the things you have to understand about Medicaid for waivers is you have to receive at least 1 service per month to remain eligible for home and community-based services beyond a waiver. But there's also a waiting list for a couple of the waivers. And this is one of those examples where we had people that were on there and the only service they were getting was the Life Alert bracelet, nothing else. The other idea behind the waiver services is supposed to keep you from being institutionalized. Keeps you out of, assisted living, out of a nursing home, long-term care, things like that. Waivers are designed so that people can stay at home. That's a great idea. It saves the state money. That's what you want. But it also, the reason they have that thing saying you need to have 1 service per month is it shows that you need benefits. Ideally, you would be getting more than 1 service per month, but that's the limit. That's the minimum. So as we looked at it, they said, well, it's for our frail and elderly population. Well, it turns out we looked at it and found that there were 5 people on the brain injury, 391 on frail and elderly, 4 on the intellectual disability, and 160 on the physical disability. That's one of those ones where there's a waiting list of people. So we had 160 people that were on the PD waiver for the only reason so that they could get Life Alert, and they were tying up those services. We further went with them on it, and we looked at the monetary side of it, and this is where we're talking about savings. We paid the MCOs over $8 million in capitation payments for providing this Life Alert bracelet service for them. And that $8 million is paid out, and that's basically a monthly premium, like an insurance premium. And we checked it and said, if we did this through fee-for-service, and the state does fee-for-service payments, it would have cost $55,000. $8,055,000. There's a savings to be had there. I get it that it would require a little bit of work to do the fee-for-service payments, but it would also get these people off of the waivers and clear up waiver positions and what have you. So KDT's response to us is that MCOs are contractually required to review member functionality and establish person-centered plans, and they see that as being a good thing to do. And it said it's applicable to our age 65 plus HCBS population, and we believe that's the best use of resources. Okay, and I then asked him to clarify if the manual, policy manual, said that if that could be billed by itself, and they confirmed that it did. And they also went on again to say that the further the service is limited to our individuals age 65 and older, and any change would require them to go to the state. Well, I rebutted and said, listen, our review found there were 147 individuals outside of the FE waiver who were under 65, which is key in receiving this. And I said, it also seems unusual that a person would only need one per service, or that need the service and not require any other type of direct support worker service. So that's the point there, is we're able to rebut with them and provide that kind of information, but I would have liked to have had to follow up with them on that. And then the last example, 3, involves the, again, HCBS, where we talked about overpayments for individuals who were not receiving services. And we said, you really need to look at something. We found out that they had a policy, and I referenced the policy there, where even if they were intended to do recoupments, they intentionally hold themselves to a 3-month look-back period. It's an artificial barrier. It's something that they created out of thin air that they put out there. There's no basis for it. CMS does not demand that. Oftentimes CMS puts arbitrary rules that seem illogical, but that's not a CMS rule. That is a KDHE rule that they do a 3-month look-back. And we asked them to consider removing that policy, and they said no, they didn't think that was a good idea. And they said that the current 3-month look-back period was established to carefully balance sound management of resources with the full risk nature of the MCO contracts. Okay. And we came back with, that's fine, but in situations where the MCOs are supposed to be looking at their clients, and bear in mind too that anybody who's on a waiver is supposed to have a case manager who's checking in with them on a regular basis. We had people on this audit who had not had services at all of any type in 40 months. That was the length of the audit. How is it that a case manager is seeing this person if they've gone 40 months with no services at all whatsoever? And so I think the MCOs bore a little bit of responsibility in identifying that to the state and letting the state, hey, no, this person's not getting services and need to be removed. There were occasions where the MCOs had identified that to the state and nothing was done. The state did not take them off. So we were not terribly pleased with how that went down, and there was an awful lot of money that was paid out that could have been recouped and just simply wasn't because of that. On the back, I have a couple of examples of the sheets that go through with, that come over on Bethel, and this is one of my complaints too. We have no input whatsoever on what gets put on this sheet. We brief things at the Bethel Committee, which is a good thing to do, but we have no input, we have no oversight on any of this. And the first one, and I apologize for the small print, I can read it with my bifocals, I hope you guys can too. But it involves the KMIS system, which we identified in the HCBS audit. The KMIS system is their tracking for functional assessments. We discovered that the KMIS system, instead of, it sends out the one notification, hey, this person has to have their annual functional assessment. But the problem is it doesn't do a tickler or anything. If it doesn't get that response back, it just leaves it open, which is a real flaw in programming for it to not do it. And we found there were people that had gone for years without functional assessments. Again, I'm going back to the MCOs. Their case managers should have been aware this person had not had their functional assessment. You are required to have a functional assessment every year to show that you continue to be eligible to be on waiver services. That's a bright line rule. There's no fuzzy area there. But the KMIS system is a failure on that, and we pointed that out. Well, they added it as an issue. We didn't know they did it. I just happened to be paying attention during one of the briefings, and oh, it's on there. That's great. They did that in 22. Here we are. They briefed on it last in 2024 at the end of Bethel last year, and they're still messing around with how they're going to do it, and they're asking for a little bit of money, $1 million in SGF to analyze the program, and they keep talking about, well, we're close to getting it out there, but nothing's happening. I mean, they're just kicking the can down the road. But I think they'd really like to get it off of the list, but fortunately, the Bethel people continue to keep it on the list for them to track. But we're not consulted, we're not asked about it, provide input. In our audit report where we talked about this, we actually recommended that it be added to the KEYS system, which is the eligibility enforcement system, and they flatly pushed that back. They don't want to do that, but it's actually possible. And in fact, one of my staff has told me that they actually had partial functionality for that in the KEYS system. They just never kicked it into gear. It would be a solution for them to do that, but instead they're wanting just hire a contractor to come in and tell them what's wrong with KMIS. We've already told them what's wrong with KMIS. Then the second issue, or the second example, involves the TransMed program. TransMed is a program that is designed to get Medicaid beneficiaries out of the program when they get a job. And what it allows you to do, and it's a great program, it allows you to get employment, maintain your Medicaid for up to a year, and then as you transition into the workforce, because sometimes some employers, your insurance doesn't start till 6 months or sometimes later after you've got a job. So this allows you to have Medicaid benefits until you're employed, until your insurance kicks in with your new job, and allows you to make that transition. That's why it's called TransMed. We're not talking about other types of trans here, just to be clear. And it's transitional. It is a program that the federal government mandates. It's a good one, but what we found when we did our audit of it, and it's listed on here, is we found that an awful lot of people were on TransMed for way beyond 12 months. And they ended up spending over $16 million on that program for people who are no longer eligible. So we had pointed it out to them, and I see on here that they had put together, KDHE put together a working group to discuss the findings and work on mitigating it. They never asked us. We were never involved. We were never invited. We would have liked to have been. It would have been really an appropriate thing. We recently completed an audit involving nursing homes. It's called the CCRC audit. One of the things that happened as a result of that audit is we had provided a suggestion for legislative change, which was implemented last year, that moved responsibility for that from the Kansas Department of Insurance over to KDADS, which is where it really belonged with long-term care. And Lacey Hunter and her group, she's one of the commissioners over there, contacted us and sought our input. We thought that was amazing. We were able to give them our insight because our people were subject matter experts by then on that. We were able to walk them through what we were seeing, what we thought was really good, and really do a deep dive. And really, I think we really helped them more efficiently adopt this new responsibility, and we're able to give them assurances about things going forward. That is, to me, was the ideal solution, or what it should look like is that our office could be involved in that. But in this case, we had no input, we weren't asked, we weren't consulted, and then they cleared it, it's closed, and we have no idea. I didn't even know they did this until I was looking at these spreadsheets and saw that they had put together a working group to look at that stuff. And so those are some things I just wanted to point out as what could be done with the audits is have corrective action plans. Have us engaged in what is going on or what ends up in these issues that are being tracked at, like at the Bethel level. There's just so many things that happen with that. And if you take the time, I know it's difficult reads. If you ever do look at our audit reports, I'll give you a look at the executive summary and then flip all the way past all the methodology and all the rules and regulations and read the findings and recommendations. I find that's what most people do. It'll save you hours of reading. But you will find the responses from the agencies are in there, and I think you'll get a flavor of it. I've touched on some of them here. I didn't want to bore you to death with all that information. But for us, it's about having to do that. As some of you may know, we've asked for an expansion of our footprint and asked for additional resources, which will allow us to do more audits, to do those follow-up audits, to follow up on things like the HCBS audit, because it's a big one and it needs to be looked at. We're also very interested because we cross-flow with the food assistance with SNAP and the food benefits as well. We currently find our investigative mission, which, by the way, we did not have an investigative mission until a year ago in August. Prior to that, we had no special agents, and nobody was doing eligibility investigations in the state of Kansas. on Medicaid at all, period. So we started that last year and got 2 agents and an analyst to do that. There's more that could be done. There's hundreds of cases out there. Like I said, we reviewed almost 1,500 complaints this past year. And I have to go through, because I review every one of them that my investigative assistant puts in our system. There's case after case after case we could be looking at of people who are clearly defrauding the system. We just don't have the people to do it. So we end up just kicking it over to the clearinghouse and letting them do something administrative. There's no recoupments ever taken on those. And I'm not talking about people who are maybe made a mistake on the system, because mistakes aren't fraud. Mistakes are willful knowledge when you lie about your income. We've got people that are making $300,000 or $400,000 a year, live in a $700,000 home, drive new cars, and they're on Medicaid because they lie about their income. Those are the people we're looking for. We're looking for people who've moved out of the state of Kansas, been gone for years, and still drawing CanCare. Those are the people we're interested in. And what we find, because we're able to see within that key system, is people's food eligibility as well. And what we have discovered is that people tell different lies to Medicaid eligibility than they tell to the food assistance eligibility people, because there's different criteria for eligibility. For Medicaid eligibility, if you have somebody, if you have a woman who has, listen, just hypothetical, has 2 kids, and she has a live-in boyfriend, but he's not the father of either kids, his income does not count against her Medicaid eligibility. If he's the father of the children, then he does. Now, sometimes they'll lie about who the dad is, but that is one of the eligibility criteria. However, on the food assistance side of the world, everybody in the house counts against your eligibility, and their income does. It doesn't matter if they're the father of the children or what the relationship is with anybody else in the house. Those all count. So we can easily see when we look at the food side and the Medicaid eligibility side that they're telling different stories, just depending on who's talking to them. And part of our desire to be able to investigate and audit SNAP, TANF, child care, things like that, are allowing us to basically protect government resources. So that's currently in House Bill 2217 that's going through the system. Take a look at that. So those are some other areas that we'd like to get involved in, because we see a natural working relationship that exists. We work with some of the investigators over there with the food assistance or food eligibility. They're not sworn people, so they can't do high-level criminal investigations. They can't look at the providers and stuff. And I know the other day at a briefing, I think it was in here, where they were talking about they had a huge skimming operation in the Kansas City area. Hopefully the feds will get involved in that, because the state people can't do anything with it. But hopefully feds will get involved. But we would like to be able to help with those type of things. There was a letter that was recent, it was last year, sent from the Department of Secretary of Agriculture to Governor Kelly, talking about how many problems exist in the SNAP program, and it really wasn't well addressed yesterday, but there's problems with that letter, in that letter where they talk about Kansas's numbers are really bad and need to be improved. So at that point, I'd love to answer questions if you have any.
Committee questions, Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Steve. This is, sitting on legislative post audit, I hear audits, and with each one, there's an agency response, and a lot of times, sometimes they'll say, yeah, we're going to do something about it. Then a year later, we hear the same audit and a follow-up, and nothing's been done. What can we do to give you the teeth on these, like a corrective action plan, require a corrective action plan, and have some consequences that, when this fraud sounds like in a lot of cases is fixable. What can we do to help you to give you the teeth to do it? Because it seems like once we get out of session, the pressure is off. Right. Hey, legislature's gone, we can put it off for another year. That to me is my big concern.
Well, I think what would happen would be good is like within the Bethel Committee, because that meets 4 times a year and they go through issues. If we had a way of helping to ensure that any audit finding ends up on that tracker that they do at Bethel, and then KDHE, KDADs have to come and stand and talk about what they're doing on those. So that would help like that if there was some initiative to require that.
if I may follow one, but if they never do any corrective action, can there be some sort of financial repercussions to the agency? Say, hey, you know, if you're not doing your job, we're not going to devote X amount of dollars to something that, you know, in other words, some kind of consequence.
Right.
Hey, we better do this. We need, because we are talking about millions of dollars of savings over time. And I've run into that. I had a fraud case with my father-in-law. He had Alzheimer's, and we found overbilling there. I didn't know who to call, called CMS. They didn't care, did not care. And it was frustrating. So I would like to see more teeth. I would like to see some, you know, if after a certain amount of time there aren't any corrective actions taken, that there are actual consequences.
Yeah, and I agree with you that, because that's how you hold people's feet to the fire and those corrective action plans. When KDADS does corrective action plans with nursing homes, they can fine them. Now, I'm not proposing that we start levying fines on KDHE per se, but it would be nice if there was some way to have them come to committee or have some process where they would have to answer for inaction or explain why what they've done to fix it. But including in that is I would like to have that we are involved in that process, because we get stonewalled on being involved in the after action part of it. You know, we issue the report and then we're left out of it.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Holscher?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think you just hit on it. You just said that we should have KDHE come to committee, because you bring up some different aspects here that part of what goes through my mind is how much control do we actually have when we're talking about MCOs and that they're essentially subcontracted. So like I said, that part makes me wonder how much control we actually have in some recommendations. But yeah, like I said, you hit the nail on the head there. I feel like we should have KDHE come to committee. We only got a glimpse yesterday, to your point, of the process in terms of checking verification. It sounds like it's a pretty in-depth, complicated process that a lot of us likely don't understand. So, yeah, you actually.
On some of the verification, in the Medicaid world, I can speak to that. They basically take the person at their word. If a person says, I have no income, and if there's nothing on their file to dispute that, then they leave it at that. Nothing is done to verify it. If they provide information, like if we have reason to believe that the individual in the house is actually the father of the children, should be financially responsible, but they say, nope, the dad's not in the house. We see that issue a lot. Turns out that they are living there. But they take their word for it unless they receive compelling information that's different from that. And one of the interesting things is Medicaid eligibility workers, there are certain rules in place to keep them from looking at the food assistance side. Our investigators look at both sides, but Medicaid eligibility people are told by their training is they're not supposed to dig. You should not be looking over on the food assistance side to see if there's something contradictory over there. So, and this is a case I briefed on before. We had a young woman who applied for pregnant woman coverage under Medicaid eligibility, said she was pregnant. They did nothing to verify the fact that she was pregnant. Just the fact that she said she was pregnant was good enough to put her on Medicaid pregnant woman coverage. The food assistance side also dealt with her. They have a little better, more restrictive rules, and they said, we need some sort of proof, please, that you're actually pregnant. So she provided a letter from her doctor saying that she had had a positive pregnancy test. Turns out the letter was a forgery. It was phony letterhead, the whole bit. They had followed up on it, but the eligibility side for Medicaid was not able to look at the food assistance side and see that there was this discrepancy. It was brought to our attention, and then we looked at it, and they said, oh yeah, she wouldn't have been eligible if she wasn't pregnant, because that's what made her pregnant. So she's currently being prosecuted, by the way. Because she also did some other frauds involving the work program and what have you, but she was made eligible because of that. But those are some things, but typically the eligibility people look only at whatever the person swears is the truth. They don't do anything to verify it. If they receive, like via a complaint from us, then they will go further sometimes to look at person's income or what have you. But you have to understand is, you know, they look at Department of Labor information, but if somebody's self-employed, nope, they can't see that at all. If the person's a federal government employee, military, they can't see that at all. So those are not available to them through the Kansas Department of Labor. Information's not in there.
Yeah, again, I think with the points that you make, then we really should hear from KDHE in regard to some of these issues you brought forward. Thank you.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Overwhelmed. How often is there a redetermination by KDHE?
Once a year.
Once a year.
Once a year.
What would you recommend?
I think it'd be nice if they did redeterminations on a 6-month cycle, but there's another type of the redeterminations that are primarily done, and this is at the encouragement of CMS, is they do what they call super passive. So they'll send a letter to you saying, hey, here's what we show as far as your situation. If we don't hear from you, we'll just assume everything's good. So if the person's moved out of state and they never get the letter, it's all good. And I really that's one of those processes I'd really like to see change, that super passive redeterminations. It should require the person to actually respond and confirm that that is their situation.
Very good, thank you.
Other questions from the committee? So, Steve, the prohibition of Medicaid and the food benefits side being able to compare, is that a state? Where is that prohibition coming from?
That is in a KDHE policy. You have to understand the workers who do eligibility determinations too are on a clock. And they have a production requirement. If you can imagine working at a phone center, they're supposed to get on and off the phone quickly. They don't have time to really ask questions or dally, but they're also, their policy says they're not supposed to dig.
Okay, thank you. Committee, any other questions? Senator Alley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the things we heard in previous testimony in this committee was there is a difference between an error and a fraud.
Yes.
And could errors be made on purpose?
Could there be? Hypothetically, yes.
And does that then become fraud?
Well, it's interesting in KDHE's policies on this, they have agency error, client error, and then, forget what the term for it is, but fraud error, they call it. And interestingly, if the matter that appears to be client error is never resolved, then it becomes agency error. Okay, it's never rendered fraud error unless it goes to a district court and there's a finding of fraud. And since KDHE never refers to anything for criminal work, they would never have a fraud error discovered. So it goes back to being agency error.
Thank you.
Senator Thompson.
So in other words, you never get any accurate numbers on fraud?
Not from KDHE. You won't.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions, committee? Thank you so much for coming and shedding light on this, and I hope that this is food for thought for the committee as to behind the curtain look at how the process works and how this committee may act upon some of these issues that we are hearing. So thank you very much, appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Committee, I would very much like to work Senate Bill 13 if there's no objection. And to remind everybody, that is the one that Mr. Barker from the Secretary of State Office brought to us about eliminating some outdated regulations. Does anyone wish to have an overview from the reviser on that? Everyone good with that bill? Okay. So at this point, I would entertain a motion to move this out of committee. Senator Thompson?
Madam Chair, I move to pass Senate Bill 13 out favorably.
Do we have a second? Senator Murphy, we have a motion from Senator Thompson and a second by Senator Murphy. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Okay, hang on just a moment. My apologies. In an effort to try to move this quickly, I need to back up. And we may need a substitute motion here to make it as amended. If you recall, Mr. Barker did bring an amendment due to the certification, if you remember, from the unions. And so we're going to pass that out, but that was not included in the original bill text. So we do need to back up and look at the amendment.
Madam Chair, I'll retract my first motion.
Thank you. With permission from the second? Yes. Okay, so that motion is retracted. So I will give the committee a moment to look at that amendment. And if there are no questions, I'll entertain a motion to amend the Senate bill to include this amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thompson?
Yes, I move to pass out Senate Bill 13 as amended favorably.
We have to adopt the amendment.
We have to, okay. Okay, I move to adopt the amendment on Senate Bill 13.
So we have a motion by Senator Thompson and a second by Senator Murphy. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion passes. Now we are back to pass the bill as amended. Senator Thompson?
I'll make that motion to pass Senate Bill 13 as amended favorably.
And we have a motion by Senator Thompson and a second by Senator Murphy. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion passes. We just kicked out our first bill. Thank you very much. Committee, just a housekeeping update. We are not going to hear Senate Bill 151. Had to think of my numbers. 151 on Monday. It still needs some work. So in light of that, we are going to move the hearing on Senate Bill 99 to Wednesday, and I know it's going to break everyone's heart. We will not meet Monday as was originally planned. So no meeting Monday. We will meet Tuesday. Are there any questions? Senator Alley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No questions, just a comment. As you watch the news, we see the committee that is meeting in Washington, D.C., the DOGE committee, if you want to call it that, gives us an update of their accomplishments. Since you have just now passed out your number one bill, should we not have a score sheet, or if you want to call it that, of the accomplishments of the committee?
Thank you, Senator Alley. And yes, and that is forthcoming. We are going to track the efficiencies that are hopefully passed once they are finalized. And I will tell you that for those who don't know, we do have a government efficiency portal that is front-facing on the legislative website as well as an email address. And that went live last Friday morning. We haven't really publicized it because it just went live. And we've had over 600 submissions to that site. And I believe that the Senate President mentioned it on the news last night. So many people hit it. It crashed this morning. But I am happy to announce it is back up and running. So yes, we are going to track all of those things that we are doing as a committee. Senator Schmidt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just, I think actually for the senator from Galley, we're doing a much better job because we haven't ended a program that saved hundreds of thousands of lives in Africa or emailed the names of a long list of CIA employees over unclassified networks. Thank you.
Anything else? Thank you, committee. Enjoy the Super Bowl, and seeing no other business before this